Don't be afraid. Be terrified.
When I was in high school, there was a teacher named Mr. Johnson who taught history. He was a strange man who always seemed to be lurking in the shadows of the classroom, never quite making eye contact with any of his students. At first we all thought he was just socially awkward, but as the weeks went by his behavior became increasingly bizarre. He would make strange comments to female students, and would always try to touch them inappropriately. Of course, he always made it seem like an accident. One day, a girl in my class reported Mr. Johnson to the principal. The principal launched an investigation and found that Mr. Johnson had a long history of sexual harassment and assault. How did they not know this before, you may ask? Well, this was the early 80s and I guess people just didn't care. Anyway, the school fired him, but that wasn't the end of the story. A few months later, I was walking home from school when I felt like someone was following me. I turned around and saw Mr. Johnson standing in the shadows behind me. I started running, but he chased after me, shouting my name. I ran as fast as I could, but he caught up to me and grabbed me by the arm. He dragged me into a nearby alleyway and pushed me up against the wall. He leaned in close and whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't have told on me. Now you're going to pay." I was terrified. I told him I wasn't the one who reported him to the principal, but he didn't listen. Luckily, I managed to break free and run away. I reported the incident to the police, but Mr. Johnson had disappeared without a trace. For weeks, I was haunted by the memory of that night. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and feel like someone was watching me. I was so afraid that I stopped going to school altogether. Eventually, the police found Mr. Johnson's body in a park in another town about 50 miles from where I lived. I don't know if he committed suicide or was killed. My parents wouldn't tell me more about it. And again, this being the 80s, we couldn't just look it up on the internet or anything. Anyway, even now, 40 years later, I still have nightmares about that man. So, to Mr. Johnson, I know that we will never meet again. Stay in hell where you belong. It was a typical summer night in July, and I had just finished a long day of work at the local grocery store. Exhausted, I hopped on my bike and began pedaling home. As I turned onto the quiet residential street where I lived, I noticed a man walking towards me on the sidewalk. At first I didn't think much of it. It wasn't uncommon to see people walking around the neighborhood at night, and the man didn't look particularly menacing. He appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s. With short dark hair, a scruffy beard, and a slightly hunched posture. He was wearing a black hoodie and jeans, which seemed a bit odd given the warm weather. As I approached him, I noticed that he was staring at me intently. His eyes locked onto mine. It was a rather uncomfortable gaze, one that made me feel uneasy. I tried to ignore him and kept pedaling, hoping that he would just pass by without incident. But as I rode past him, I heard him say something under his breath. It was a low, guttural sound, like he was muttering to himself. I couldn't quite make out what he was saying, but it sent a chill down my spine. I felt like he was talking about me, like he knew something about me that I didn't. I turned around to look at him and saw that he had stopped walking, and was now standing in the middle of the sidewalk, staring directly at me. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, and I pedaled faster, hoping to get away from him as quickly as possible. As I approached my house, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had made it home safely, and the strange man was nowhere in sight. But just as I was about to park my bike in the garage, I heard a voice behind me. "Excuse me, miss. the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can I ask you a question?" I turned around and saw him, standing a few feet away from me, his hands buried deep in his hoodie pockets. He looked nervous, fidgety, like he was about to bolt any moment. Mind you, this guy must have ran here the entire way to keep up with me. Why would he do something like that? What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, taking a step closer to me. "I just need to ask you something. It's really important." I didn't like the way he was looking at me, like he was sizing me up, trying to figure out if I was an easy target. I took a step back, putting some distance between us. "I don't have time for this," I said, my heart racing. "I need to go inside now, please leave my property." But the man wasn't deterred. He kept inching closer to me, his eyes locked onto mine. "Please," he said, his voice growing more urgent. "I need your help. I'm lost and I don't know where to go." I didn't believe him for a second. He didn't look lost. He looked like he knew exactly where he was, and even if he was lost, I didn't want to get involved. I just wanted to get away from him as quickly as possible. "I'm sorry I can't help you," I said, turning around and heading towards the garage. But as I reached for the garage door handle, I felt a sharp pain in my back. I turned around and saw that the man stabbed me with a knife. The blade burned deep in my flesh. I screamed in pain, stumbling backwards. The man quickly pulled the knife out of my back and lunged towards me, his eyes filled with a crazed look. I stumbled back, trying to get away from him, but he grabbed me by the arm and pulled me towards him. "Please let me go," I said, my voice muffled from all the pain I was in. But the man dragged me towards him and slammed me against the garage door, his knife glinting in the moonlight. "Shut up," he hissed, pressing the knife against my throat. "Don't scream or I'll kill you." I was terrified, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do, I didn't know how to get away from him. The pain had drained all my energy. The man started to rummage through my pockets, looking for something. I didn't know what he was searching for, but I knew it couldn't be good. "Where is it?" he muttered, his hand shaking. "Where is it?" I didn't answer. At this point, I was too weak to speak. The man started to grow impatient, his grip on the knife tightening. "Tell me where it is," he said, his voice filled with anger. "I don't know what you're talking about," I whispered. The man let out a frustrated sigh and stepped back, the knife still in his hand. He looked at me with a look of disgust, like I was an inconvenience to him. "I'll be back," he said, his voice low and menacing. "And when I am, you better have what I'm looking for." And with that, he turned and ran off into the night, leaving me lying on the ground, bleeding and scared. I don't know how long I laid there. After some time, I blacked out. When I came to me again, I was in a hospital bed, my parents by my side. I did make a full recovery. The police never found the guy, and to this day, I never knew what he was looking for. All I know is that he was completely insane. So, to the maniac who stabbed me for no reason whatsoever, let's not meet. It was a pretty cold evening. I had just finished my shift at the local diner and was walking home alone as I always did. The street was deserted and quiet, except for the occasional sound of rustling leaves. As I walked, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was nobody there. I've always been somewhat of a scaredy cat, so I quickened my pace, feeling a sense of unease. The footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. Suddenly, a hand reached out and grabbed me by the shoulder, causing me to jump in fright. "Excuse me, miss," a man's voice said. "I'm sorry to startle you, but could you please help me? My car broke down and I need you to call a tow truck." I looked at the man, who appeared to be in his mid-40s, with disheveled hair and a scruffy beard. I felt really uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude. "Sure," I said. "There's a payphone a few blocks from here. I can show you where it is." As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the guy. He kept glancing at me, almost as if he was sizing me up. When we reached the payphone, the guy pulled out his phone instead. "I think I can just call the tow truck from here," he said. At this point I felt really disturbed. Why would this guy ask me to call a tow truck for him when he had his cell phone with him the entire time? I just nodded at him and started to walk away, but the man called out to me. "Hey, wait a minute," he said. "I don't even know your name. What is it?" I hesitated, but eventually gave him a fake name. I said it was Jennifer. Just for the record, my real name is Emily. The man smiled and thanked me before walking away. As I continued on my way home, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. I felt like I was being watched and couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still following me. When I finally arrived at my house, I quickly locked the door behind me and checked all the windows. I was relieved to see that everything was secure, but as I settled into my bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped a dangerous stranger. I made a mental note to be more careful in the future and to trust my instincts when it comes to strangers. Oh, and to the guy who made me walk with him to a payphone, even though he had a stupid cell phone with him, I hope we never meet again.